All right, so before we get started, we just wanted to, again, welcome you to the Cox Campus year-long learning journey. On the next slide, we have just a few of our core values written out, and we just want, or things we want you to get out of today's session. We hope that your experience with us today is rewarding, that it is empowering, that you feel connected, that you feel welcomed, and that the information that we share you feel is essential research and helpful for your practice. So we hope that you experience those today with us and that today is a positive learning experience. On the next slide, we also are going to share in the chat a link to Cox Campus. So if you aren't a member, please join us on Cox Campus. Joining is quick, easy, and free. So once you join, you'll also have access to all of our free courses, all of our free resources. Some of the resources we'll be sharing in today's session. And also today's session is on reading fluency. So there's a reading fluency course on Cox Campus that will expand on a lot of the information being shared today. So please check that out. All right. So before we begin, I want to introduce myself and my lovely co-facilitator, Anisha. So my name is Alistair Smith, and I'm one of the K-3 content creators here and instructional designers at Cox Campus. And now I'm going to pass it over to the lovely Anisha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anisha Donald, and I'm also a content creator and instructional designer here at Cox Campus. Welcome.
And I would also be remiss if I didn't call out these two lovely ladies who are helping everything run smoothly. And if you have any questions throughout today's session, please share questions in the chat and one of us will try to help you as quick as we can. All right, so let's start with our session goals. So in today's session, we have two main goals. As we mentioned earlier, this K-3 year-long learning journey series has been focused on language-centered classrooms. You may have attended some of the previous sessions that talked a little bit more about phonics instruction or phonemic awareness. Today, we will specifically be discussing how speech-to-print approach applies to reading fluency. So we will discuss how the speech-to-print approach applies to reading fluency, but also we'll be getting into assessment a little bit and understanding how to assess and analyze oral reading fluency data. Throughout our session, we also really encourage you to participate, whether it's coming off mute or writing in the chat. We would love for everyone to be able to engage with each other and that the session would be a valuable experience to you. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anisha as we begin to define and discuss reading fluency.
All right. Thank you so much, Alistair. And as Alistair said, we have a smaller group here today, which is totally fine. But we hope that with those smaller numbers means that you all will engage with us and talk with us because we really, really do appreciate it. All right. So let's get started with defining fluency. What is fluency? So when we think about fluency, we can compare it to driving a car. Right? So when we're driving a car, when we're beginning to drive, there are a number of things that we need to remember. All right, so let's look at some of the things we need to remember when we're driving a car. How to hold your hand, reminders to check the mirrors, using turn signals, how much pressure maybe you need to apply to the gas and the brake when you're driving. So there are just a number of things that you have to remember when you're beginning to drive a car. And all of these aspects of driving often require prompting from a more experienced driver at first because you don't know. And so it can be stressful in the beginning, but it becomes easier with practice. So on the next slide, when we think about fluency and beginning to read for beginning readers, fluency is fluent reading really requires the merging of these necessary components and subskills. So again, let's look at some of those components. Connecting letters to sounds, blending sounds, recognizing word parts, accurate decoding, making those inferences. All of these components are a part of fluent reading. Fluent reading also requires this guidance from an expert, just like with driving a car, and lots of practice. Just like with learning to drive a car. So what begins as this new and unfamiliar process kind of turns into something exciting once you're able to do it independently. And that goes for driving or reading. All right, so let's move to the next slide. So this quote says, fluent reading should sound like speech. And so, again, with our driving analogy, just as driving with an experienced driver allows you to relax and enjoy a nice, smooth ride, fluent reading should be smooth like speech. Now, when we think about kind of our brains are wired for speech. We weren't wired to read, we were wired to speak. And so often when people speak very fast, it's hard to process what they say. And so similarly, when words are spoken very slowly or with too much space in between each word, it's also difficult to follow. And so because our brains are wired to understand spoken language, reading really should mimic a similar cadence in order for our brains to process what we're reading. So that's what we mean when we say fluent reading should sound like speech, because our brains are already wired for speech. When we read fluently, it should sound how we speak so that our brains can process it. All right, next slide. So when we get down kind of to the nitty gritty of the definition of what fluency means, Hasbrook and Glacier define fluency as reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation to read. So from this definition, we're going to kind of break down those components of literacy, or I'm sorry, of fluency. Now, if you look on the screen at the bottom left-hand corner, there's like this little iceberg. And this iceberg kind of represents how these components of fluency are really just the tip of the iceberg, right? And so those components that you see at the top, those, yes, are important, but each component includes a number of sub-skills that must be mastered in depth in order for fluent reading to take place. So we kind of want to make sure that we reiterate that. You'll hear me talking more about the iceberg a little bit later, that the components that we're going to talk about, they involve a number of sub-skills. So we're going to take a closer look at each of these components now. All right, fluency components. So sometimes when people think of fluency, they automatically kind of just think of speed, and that's it. But fluency is more than just speed. It is the sum of these three components: accuracy, rate, and prosody. All of those together equate to fluent reading. And so going back to that iceberg that I just mentioned, accuracy, rate, and prosody are the measurable and observable components on the surface, but we know that fluency can't be built in isolation. Underneath the surface, we have these components and many interrelated sub-skills that need to be considered in order for fluency to be firmly established. All right, so let's look at that first component, accuracy, on the next slide. Accuracy is the ability to recognize and decode words correctly. So thinking back to that Glaser and Hasbrook definition of fluency, they say reasonably accurate reading. And so that just means that students may not be recognizing and decoding every single word every single time, but they are reading within a certain range so that their comprehension isn't hindered. So when it says reasonably accurate, that means they may not get every single word right every single time, but they're getting enough right so that their comprehension isn't hindered. And so on the next slide, we're gonna look and talk a little bit more about this range. All right. So in 2018, the National Association of Educational Progress, also known as NAEP, they conducted an oral reading fluency study to examine reading fluency and foundational skills. It was about 1,800 fourth grade public school students across the nation. And just so you all are aware, the NAEP reading assessment only measures reading comprehension. That's the only thing that it measures. And so this graphic kind of shows us that when reading grade level text, If students aren't reading between that top range of 95 to 98% accuracy that you see there in purple, they do not perform well on measures of comprehension. And in the orange circle, even with the 92 and 94% accuracy, students are only able to score below basic on a measure of comprehension. And so this really tells us that there is a direct correlation between accuracy and comprehension. The lower the accuracy, the lower the measure of comprehension is going to be. And so accuracy really matters when it comes to understanding what we read. Again, when we talk about reasonably accurate reading, students need to be they need to be in that range of the 95 to 98% in order to be fluent and not have their comprehension hindered. All right, next slide. So now we're going to talk about how to calculate this accuracy. And hopefully, I have some mathematicians in the room, maybe, that will work with me to kind of figure this out. All right, so we're going to use this student as an example, and we're going to calculate their accuracy to kind of figure out which level accuracy this student is reading at, either independent, instructional, or frustration. So at first, I want to talk a little bit about just the markings that you see at the bottom. So when we look at the text, which is called Building Happy Places at the bottom of the screen, you see green markings and you see red markings. And so the green markings are where the teacher has noted the student's errors as the student has read aloud. And when we think about errors, typically you're going to see three types of errors. So you're going to see that the student either misread a word, the student skipped a word, or the student really didn't know what the word was at all. And so the teacher told the student what the word was. Okay. So those are the three errors that you're going to see. And so the student will read for 1 minute. And after that 1 minute is up, the teacher will draw a line to signify that's how far the student got within that 1 minute. So that red line that you see is where the student stopped once the minute was up. All right, so when you're calculating accuracy, you can see it says kind of in the top right-hand corner, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you're looking at the total words read, and the correct words. So you're only focusing on everything up to the red line, everything up to what they read within that minute. You're not concerning yourself with anything after that red line. All right, so in order to calculate this, we need to take the number of correct words and divide it by the total number of words read within that 1 minute. So can anybody tell me how many total words the student read?
47.
47, thank you, Dorothy. So 47 would go at the bottom because that's the total number of the words read. What about the number of correct words? So that would be 47 minus however many errors they made. Anybody want to take a shot at it?
Five errors.
Okay, 5 errors. Thank you, Dorothy. So 47 total words read minus 5 errors. That means it's 42 correct words. So we're dividing 42 by 47, and we're multiplying that by 100. And Dorothy, would you happen to have that answer? Are you doing it along with me?
89%.
Thank you, Dorothy, 89%. All right, so let's go ahead and put that on the screen. Very good. So we have 89% as their accuracy. And then looking at the little chart below, independent, instructional, or frustration, which one is 89%? It's frustration. So we know that this, based off of the calculation of the accuracy, this text is too difficult. And so the comprehension is likely going to be hindered for this student. All right. All right, next slide. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up accuracy, let's talk about the 5 F's. So, first, accuracy is the first thing that is developed when thinking about fluency. Before students can focus on other components, attention must be spent to identifying those letters, words, phrases accurately. And so to the right of your screen, at the top, you see what we call the fluency ramp. And this is really just a great visual for how fluency develops. So as you can see in that graphic, accuracy is at the very beginning. It is first because you have to build accuracy first before you can move on to anything else. And we also want to highlight here that accuracy is built and developed in progressions. So directly under the fluency ramp, you can see that accuracy really begins with letters. It includes letter formations, and then it progresses to word, and it progresses to phrases, all the way on to all the way through longer text. So we want to make sure that we highlight that not only do you need to start with accuracy, but you also need to remember that accuracy develops in progressions. All right, the second F is foremost. So without accuracy, we really lose the ability to make meaning. Therefore, according to Hasbrook, accuracy is the most important component of fluency. There's a reason that it is first. If you don't have accuracy, you can't move on to any of the other components. Forever. Reading text accurately applies to all readers, whether you're an emerging reader or you're an adult who reads fluently. Again, without accuracy, meaning breaks down. So attention must always, always, forever be paid to reading text accurately. Foundation. Now, while accuracy is the foundation, it is not the end goal. Looking at the fluency ramp again, we see that only with sufficient practice can students really move to become a fluent reader. They must build accuracy and practice it, and then before they can move on to any other component. So we have to be careful to not assume that because students are accurate with maybe only a few exposures to a skill, that they will automatically become fluent. They have to build it and practice it. The skills must be built and they must be practiced. And so we want to make sure that when you look at that fluency ramp, that you're understanding the importance of not just building it, but practicing it, building and practicing. Those are important. They work together in order for students to become fluent. All right, so let's move on to our next component. Here we are with rate. All right, so rate is the speed at which you read. And as I mentioned earlier, when sometimes when people think of fluency, they think of speed, right? So speed does have a purpose here, but when we think about speed, sometimes we think about like fast, right? Or maybe slow. But is faster always better? Is slower always better? So we're just going to take a quick listen to each of these, someone reading at a faster rate and a slower rate, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So let's listen to the faster rate.
Strange Bedfellows, the title of a recent letter to the Museum News in which a certain Harriet Sherman excoriated the National Gallery of Art in Washington for handling the tickets of the much ballyhooed Van Gogh's exhibit. A huge proportion of the 2,000 free tickets were snatched up by the opportunists in the dead of winter, who then got those tickets to the $85 repeat to less hardy connoisseurs.
Well, that was interesting. All right. What about the slower? Let's listen to that one.
Yet Sherman's bedfellows are
Okay.
from
Is that the end of it?
strange art, despite its religious and magical origins very soon became a commercial venture.
All right. Well, that was also interesting. So when it comes to is faster always better, is slower always better? I think it's safe to say the answer would be no for both of those, based off of what we just heard. So when it comes to rate, it's not about reading as fast or as slow as possible. Rate is all about reading at an appropriate rate. Emphasis on appropriate. So rate can really vary depending on the text that you are reading. And kind of going back to our car analogy, whenever we're driving to an unfamiliar place, or if we're driving on an unfamiliar road, we typically will slow down to make sure that we don't miss a turn, right? And so reading a text is similar. If we're reading a text that maybe is unfamiliar or the topic is unfamiliar, sometimes we have to slow down in order to retain that meaning, to make sure that we're understanding what we're reading. And again, when we're driving on familiar roads, however, we don't need to slow down because we know where we're going, and we know we're familiar with the road. And so we kind of go on this autopilot, right? And so rate is the same way. We adjust our rate depending on the text. So it's not about reading fast or slow. It's about reading at the appropriate speed for the text. So on the next slide, let's look at what's appropriate. Let's talk about what's appropriate on the next slide.
A recent letter yet, Sherman.
Uh-oh. Okay. So going back to our quote earlier from Stahl and Kuhn, fluent reading should sound like speech. So in order for that to happen, students need to be reading at an appropriate rate. But what is appropriate? They need to be reading an appropriate number of words correct per minute. So let's look at what that means. This chart that you see kind of in the middle of your screen, it has the compiled oral reading fluency, or ORF, norms. And this chart shows us what the appropriate words correct per minute should be for each grade level. And these ORF norms provide an approximate words correct per minute for the 10th, 25th, 50th, and 90th percentiles. So when we talk a little bit later about calculating rate and where students should fall, resources like this really help us to know what is appropriate. What should we be expecting from our students at a particular grade level? All right, moving to the next slide. So again, we have more of this NAEP data from our fourth graders here, and this is specific to words correct per minute. And you can see that in order to demonstrate advanced proficiency in comprehension, 160 words correct per minute, or performance in the 75th percentile, is necessary. So you'll see that kind of in that purple circle. That's performance in the 75th percentile. Similarly, to achieve basic and proficient, students must be performing in the 50th percentile, and that's where you'll see in the green circle there. So for the orange and the red circles, those are the performances in the 25th and the 10th percentile. And as you can see, that puts students in the below basic ranges. So pretty much what this tells us is that the research suggests that the 75th percentile is sufficient for optimizing comprehension, and the 50th percentile is necessary for comprehension. So really, anything below the 50th percentile is going to hinder comprehension. So again, when we're looking at, what's appropriate, where should we want our students to be, and where should we expect them to be, it really should be 50th at the very least. That's like minimum, but 75 really will optimize their comprehension. All right, so on the next slide, let's talk about calculating rate and words correct per minute. All right, so this is our student again from earlier. And when we are determining words correct per minute, we begin with the total words read in 1 minute. So thinking back to when we were calculating accuracy, how many words were read within that 1 minute? Does anybody remember? Working on my wait time. Okay, I'll tell you. There were 47. So you start with the words correct per minute, which are 47. And then, I'm sorry, you start with the total words that they read, which are 47. And then you take away the errors. Does anybody remember how many errors the student had?
5.
5. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you for humoring me. I appreciate it. And so when we have 47, we take away 5, we're left with 42. All right, so our words correct per minute is 42. We can go ahead and put that on the screen. All right, so when we look at our chart at the very top left-hand corner and we're trying to figure out, well, where does 42 fall in the percentile range? So in what percentile range is this student performing? Is it the 10th, the 25th, the 50th, the 75th? Kind of looks like that line is in the middle. It's in the middle, right? So really the student is performing between the 10th and the 25th percentile. And as we said earlier, anything below 50 is really going to hinder comprehension. So once you calculate accuracy and rate to see where students fall, really that score that you receive is really just the beginning. Going back to our iceberg, it's really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. If those calculations show that the student is performing below level, then that's when you really have to begin to look at what are some of those sub skills underneath the iceberg to help you determine what else is going on. Why are they not being fluent in this way? Why are they not showing proper accuracy and proper rate? All right, moving on to our last component, prosody. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because we really just wanted to focus more on accuracy and rate today. But prosody or expression is the tonal or rhythmic aspects of language. And so basically, when we think about just reading as a whole, the whole purpose of reading is to understand language, communicate, and express ideas. So NAEP says that when students read a passage out loud with appropriate expression, they are using their ability to comprehend language as well as read the words in the passage. And so reading with suitable expression really tells us whether or not students are comprehending what they're reading. That's the biggest thing about expression or prosody. It really is an indicator of whether or not students are comprehending as a whole, which of course is the ultimate goal of reading. All right, so on the next slide, when we think about expressive reading, oral language really is the foundation. On the left side of the screen, we see speaking and listening. Excuse me, and how a message is conveyed, thinking about kind of all of those prosodic elements used, pauses, emphasis, volume, phrasing, tone, how a message is conveyed directly impacts the intent and the meaning. So how we speak and how we take in that information directly impacts the intent and meaning. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see reading. And the way students are reading really impacts their understanding of what they are reading. And so it's really important to note here that younger readers should be reading out loud in order to aid in making meaning and comprehending. And even, when I think about myself as an adult, sometimes if I am reading, I will go back and reread something orally in order to ensure that I'm fully understanding it. So we really wanted to kind of make the connection here, the importance of oral language and that reading out loud to kind of help with that meaning. And so therefore, prosodic reading or expressive reading and speaking really does improve our ability to make meaning. So prosody and expression really is all about making meaning at the end of the day, which again is the goal for reading. All right, so now I want to pose a question to you all. When we're thinking about fluency, we can go to the next slide. Can you tell me in your own thoughts how you feel fluency connects to a language-rich environment? All of our sessions this year have been about creating this language-rich environment. So how does fluency do that? You can respond in the chat or you can unmute. How do you think fluency connects to a language-rich environment? Nobody wants to talk to me? All right, we'll move on. So on the next slide, basically, when children are learning to read, they start with speech and they move to print. And so when we're thinking about how this speech to print approach applies to fluency, we have to go back and talk about oral language. So let's look at the next slide. And I will say here, if you haven't taken our oral language course, we highly recommend that you take some time to take the course, because that's where you'll learn about the components of oral language and how all the components that deal with oral language. So oral language includes 5 major components: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and social communication. And when we think about fluency as a whole, fluency really is the culmination of all those 5 components of oral language. So in order to fluently read, you must be able to apply all of those components of oral language. And so this graphic that you see on your screen really kind of just illustrates how essential oral language is to fluency. Oral language is the foundation. It's the bridge that students need in order to make meaning. And I kind of keep reiterating, like, the goal, of course, is to get to the other side of the bridge to comprehend, to construct meaning. And oral language really is the foundation within fluency in order to do that. All right, next slide. So hopefully, you all have seen this graphic before, but if not, this is the simple view of reading. And according to the simple view of reading, we have decoding multiplied by language comprehension to equal reading comprehension. And so when we think about decoding, that's the process of using letter sound knowledge to read words. Language comprehension is the ability to gain meaning from spoken words. So when we think back to our fluency ramp, students must be able to build and practice those decoding skills. Remember, you have to build it and you have to practice it in order to become skilled in it. And so in order to achieve the ultimate goal of reading comprehension, if students don't have that strong foundation in decoding and language comprehension skills, then the reading comprehension will not happen. They have to have both in order for reading comprehension to happen. And fluency, of course, aids in that and helps for in order for students to be able to be fluent in decoding and language comprehension so that they can comprehend what they're reading. All right, next slide. Now here we just wanted to kind of specifically show how decoding impacts those components of fluency. And so if students struggle with decoding, that's going to impact their accuracy, their rate, and their prosody. Earlier, I talked about how students start with speech and move to print, right? But when we talk about decoding and fluency, we're actually then moving from print to speech. So really, once students become fluent readers, they really have this kind of reciprocal relationship with speech and print, which is ultimately what we want them to be able to do when they are fluent, proficient readers. All right, so lastly, before I turn it back over to Alistair, I'm going to read this quote on the next slide. And I want you to kind of think about maybe what sticks out for you from this quote. When the reader must devote a large amount of attention to decoding words, there is little working memory left for thinking about what's being read. Although there is more to fluent reading than just accurate decoding, lack thereof often results in an inadequate reading pace and diminished prosody. So, is there anything that kind of sticks with you from this quote? It could be a word, phrase, sentence, connection, thought, idea. Anything anybody would like to share?
Anisha, I feel like this really drives home the point about accuracy being first and foremost that you talked about so beautifully earlier. Like if a student is not able to read the words on the page with accuracy, these other elements of fluency aren't going to be able to happen.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much, Alistair. I actually wrote that for myself as well. Even though all three components matter, you have to begin with accuracy. If accuracy isn't built and sustained, then pace and prosody will be inadequate, and then comprehension won't happen. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, and I see we have someone put in the chat too. Thank you. Yep, accuracy is the foundation. I think that first foremost foundation slide really drove that point home. And also I think a really helpful visual with fluency was the ramp and seeing the ramp, that even though there's these three components. And so that's going to even transition into the next part where we're talking a little bit more about assessment and assessment with fluency. In the same vein, we're going to focus a little bit more on accuracy and rate. We also will touch on prosody a little bit, but we're going to focus on accuracy and rate because those two components are automaticity or comprise automaticity when you have accuracy and you have rate. So this next part, we'll talk a little bit more about our second goal, which was to understand how to assess and analyze oral reading fluency data, and also just speaking to fluency assessment in general. So on the next slide, let's start with, I think, probably the most predominant fluency assessment, which is the oral reading fluency assessment, or an ORF. So once our students are able to engage with connected text, we begin our reading assessment process with an oral reading fluency passage. And the reason that we start with this assessment is because in order, as Anisha highlighted through her presentation, in order to read fluently, all other elements, it's dependent on all other elements of reading to kind of be in place. So decoding, phonemic awareness, some of those reading skills we've talked about in our previous sessions, they have to be solidified for a student to be able to read an oral reading fluency passage. And on the other hand, if a student is experiencing difficulty during this assessment or a breakdown is identified, it signals the need for us as a teacher or educator to dig deeper with more assessments to really pinpoint where the student is struggling and where that issue is happening as they're trying to read. So when we think of it that way, we can almost compare an oral reading fluency assessment to a thermometer. Both of these tools have sufficient reliability and validity to measure what they're intending to measure. They both generate results fairly quickly. That's why oral reading fluency assessments are so often used as screeners. They are time efficient. And both of these measures have a number or a score that can be compared to an established benchmark. So with oral reading fluency, those grade level norms that Anisha showed earlier, when you're comparing words correct per minute or accuracy to a grade level norm, and with the thermometer, obviously 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit. So finally, both of those tools indicate overall health or wellness. So thermometer, obviously your health or wellness, but also oral reading fluency assessments, that overall reading ability, is that intact? Is there an issue there that needs to be investigated? And on the flip side of that, so both a thermometer and an oral reading fluency assessment aren't going to specify the exact issue that's at hand. So if you're not feeling well and you use a thermometer to take your temperature and you have a fever, it doesn't necessarily tell you or diagnose what you have or what illness you have or what you're sick with, but it does tell you that something's going on. You may need to meet with a doctor, more diagnostic tests may need to be done to get to the root of the issue. So on our next slide, we're going to highlight a little bit about why oral reading fluency is important. And we're talking about oral reading fluency assessments in relation to reading fluency, but as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of overlap where oral reading fluency assessments also will tell us about a student's comprehension. So this is another, the research shown on this slide for context. A perfect match would be 1. So when we're looking at all these different measures, obviously the oral reading fluency assessment has the strongest correlation to comprehension compared to these other testing measures. So if you think back earlier to the example Anisha gave us with the NAEP study and how similar the words correct per minute and accuracy percentages were for 4th grade students and comprehension measures, this is kind of another illustration of that role of comprehension. But on the next slide, there's also some things to consider with that. If a student's oral reading fluency data reveals that they are at or above the 50th percentile, the student is likely to have comprehended the text. But there still is a distinction there that we can't really make a statement about a student's language comprehension or speak to the abilities anywhere beyond that. It's just kind of an indicator. And on the other hand, if a student's most likely not proficient in reading comprehension if that WRF assessment reveals they're falling below the 50th percentile for their grade level. They are reading words below a 90 to 95% accuracy score. As Anisha kind of showed earlier, that accuracy score, once you fall below a certain mark, those comprehension suffers, and research and test data has shown us that. Or if a student's reading expression is extremely choppy and disfluent, I'm sure all of you have had experiences with that, it's likely indicating that the student's not comprehending what they've read. So even though there's a huge level of predictive validity with an oral reading fluency assessment and comprehension, again, that warning that we can't use that to speak to a student's language comprehension proficiency. What it can help us do is when we're doing that initial quick rapid screener of an oral reading fluency assessment, we see one of these indicators is showing us, hey, the student's likely not comprehending. We need to do a little bit more testing into their language comprehension to figure out what is going on. All right, so in the next slide, we're going to speak to the administration of these assessments. You may have administered an oral reading fluency assessment already. We also have a resource that we'll share in the chat, Fluency Assessment Guidelines, that will go over the information we're sharing now and have some of the additional information like the grade level norms for words correct per minute. So please check that out, download it, use it. But when you're administering an ORF, the test is administered individually. So it is a quick test, but it requires a teacher or an educator administering that one-on-one with the student. It's also important, as we spoke to earlier, that the message students are hearing during this test is to do your best reading or read carefully. We never want to send the message that a student's trying to read as fast as they can. And I'm sure you have worked with those students who will come in and that is what they feel like they're being evaluated on, and they'll try to read as quickly as they can. And sometimes it does take that reminder to let them know, no, it's not a race, that you're not being judged on how fast you can possibly read it. You want to provide the student with a passage that is at grade level and unpracticed. So we also call that a cold read, a passage they haven't seen before, so that it's truly measuring their ability to recognize words and decode, and it's not something that's familiar to the students. The student's reading orally for 60 seconds or 1 minute, and you're following the standardized procedures for scoring, which again are outlined on that resource we shared. And finally, you're calculating the number of words read correctly per minute to get that idea of rate and compare it to the national norms. Another thing to call out here is, especially with students who may have performance anxieties, some students may need more than just that 1 minute assessment to kind of get an accurate measure. So one thing I think that is always helpful is giving students maybe a passage that you're not technically using for data, but that they're seeing you mark down, because some students will get nervous when they see you marking on your page. So allowing, preferably that passage could even be one that they're going to be able to read a little bit more confidently, just to kind of get them in the swing of things and make sure that the data that you're capturing is accurate. All right, so in our next slide, we're just going to show a quick example. This is actually from Dibble's 8th edition, so some of you may have used this before. It is one of the oral reading fluency assessments that are often used in schools. This is a first grade example. And so the student would have a copy of the passage that they're reading off of, and then the person administering the test would have their own protocol as well to mark those errors, similar to the example we saw earlier. And on the next slide, we're just showing an example of what those grade level norms look like. I know we were able to get a preview of them earlier. Hasbrook and Tyndall norms are, very widely used. And also we have a copy of those norms for you on the Fluency Assessment Guidelines resource. The next slide, one point to speak to is, so if you have been administering some of these oral reading fluency screeners, such as Acadience or other measures, you may see that some of these assessments require 3 passages or 3 probes instead of 1. So a student would be reading 3 1-minute probes at the grade level, and that you would then be selecting the median of these 3 scores to compare that words correct per minute to grade level norms. And really the big point, I think, behind multiple passages comes down to the role that vocabulary and background knowledge play in a student's reading fluency. So if you think about it, I mean, in my own experience, if I'm reading an article about education, I'm able to read that with a much greater level of fluency than I would an article on cardiovascular health with a bunch of vocabulary that I haven't seen before. Even if the syntax of those 2 articles are fairly similar, just because I have some background knowledge in that area and I'm more comfortable with it. So each of our students is bringing in a wealth of knowledge to the classroom every day. And it's important to think about, if your passage is on baseball, and one student plays baseball every afternoon and grew up watching baseball games, their fluency score is likely going to be impacted. And on the flip side of that, a student who doesn't have that exposure may, without that second level of kind of investigation as a teacher and or professional, knowing your student that you are assessing, it requires you to dig a little deeper. And I think those having different types of topics and exposing students to different forms of passages when we're evaluating their fluency or their comprehension is so important. So on our next slide, we're going to take a minute and kind of put together everything that we've been talking about with reading fluency and apply it in a case study example. So this student is 8 years old. He is in 2nd grade, and he has an individualized education plan for speech articulation goals. His parents have noted concerns about his progress. And so this passage on the far right is from the Acadience Oral Reading Fluency Assessment. It's for grade 2. And as you can tell when you're looking at this passage, it's not a decodable text that's focusing on one feature skill or featuring one specific skill. But this passage features a variety of different skills that we would expect a 2nd grader to have received instruction on. So let's watch the video. And as we're watching the video, look at the notes on the bottom of the screen and try to compare what you're hearing with the notes of the person who is administering this assessment wrote, because we're going to talk about that a little bit afterwards.
Read this story to me and do your best reading.
It was the first day of summer
Vacation.
Okay.
Gavin
was
excited.
He had decided to jump off the diving board at the community pool. Summer, May
Okay. So as you were listening to him read and comparing it with the notes on the protocol, does anybody have any noticings or wonderings about either the student's reading or how the scoring was reflected on that example that you would mind sharing with the group, either in the chat or come off mute if it's easier? I'll give everyone a minute to kind of look at the marking on the protocol as well.
She only gave him about 3 to 5 seconds to decode a word before she told him.
That's a good point, Dorothy. And I think some different, so this was Acadiant, some different assessments will have different protocols when it comes to a teacher assisted response like that. And it's, some of it does come down to, you know, knowing your student, but there usually there is that kind of 3 second, or there's a certain time limit that you give the student to practice or to begin applying their decoding skills. And if they're not, then the teacher provides the word, which is counted as an error. And so obviously the student was struggling with some of those, I mean, multisyllabic words like vacation and decided, some of those trickier words that the teacher was providing. That's a great observation. Anything else? Does anybody, does you know, this kind of a profile sound familiar, maybe that you're seeing when you're administering these assessments or when you have administered these assessments? I know for me, observing this and hearing and marking down some of the errors, you can tell that obviously the student is struggling with that accuracy piece. And because of that, just as we were talking about earlier, a rate can't come when the student is struggling to get the words read accurately. And then even beyond that, prosody or that expressive reading isn't going to be possible when the student's so focused on just decoding the word in front of them. So on the next slide, let's look at it just a little bit more and use some of those, put some of those formulas to use that Nisha walked us through so beautifully earlier in the presentation. So first, we're going to begin with the words correct per minute. So if you see that orange bar right there, that indicates how to count from the new line. So the line is starting at 24, last would be word 25. And the video cut off when he substituted may for many, but it really went to of, which would have been the 28th word. So the student read 28 words in 1 minute, but we know we want to get that words correct per minute score. So looking at the protocol with all of the teacher assisted words, those all count as an error. So it's 7 total errors. And then we subtract 7 from that 28 total read to get 21 words correct per minute. So take a minute, look at on the top right, that Hasbrook and Tyndall grade level norm for words correct per minute, and see what insights you might have given that words correct per minute calculation and knowing that the student was in the winter of 2nd grade. What does that grade level comparison help with, or what can you take from that? And feel free to write in the chat if that's easier too. Either one. All right, so I'm noticing that that 21 words correct per minute is showing that the student is not on grade level. It helps us to see that they're falling behind pretty significantly. And then jumping ahead to that calculation for accuracy, the student was reading with 75% accuracy. And we know earlier, if anything was below 90 to 95% accuracy, comprehension would be impaired. So this is showing us this student is not going to be able to comprehend the passage with this level of reading fluency. On the next slide, I'm going to quickly, because I know we're wrapping up on our time here, just mention prosody as that third component. And we're going to drop a resource in the chat for measuring prosody. It's a little more of a subjective component. We don't have the same formulas that we do with the other components of fluent reading. But be sure to check out that resource. The biggest thing here is that we need to give a student an ORF first, because we can't evaluate a student's prosody if they're not reading that passage with a certain level of accuracy and rate. So those need to be calculated first to be able to find the passage that they could be evaluated on. And we're going to go ahead and skip the next slide and jump ahead to reviewing our session goals, which was to understand how the speech to print approach applies to sound symbol relationships and phonics, and then to reading fluency, and then to explore methods and resources for how to analyze fluency data. So on the next slide, we're going to take just a quick minute to reflect. I know we're almost right at time here. So if you don't mind coming off mute or sharing in the chat, something that you learned that aligned with your thinking, or maybe something new that you're going to take away from today's presentation. Were there any new insights today through the presentation? Or maybe even something that was just reaffirming for what you're noticing with your students? As you're thinking on that and reflecting, please feel free to come off mute or share in the chat, but we are also going to go ahead and just share our poll from today with you on the next slide, just so that you can be responding to that. But please share in the chat. I see somebody shared that they loved the visual of the fluency ladder that Anisha shared. I agree. I feel like that visual is probably my #1 favorite visual when it comes to fluency, just because you hear about the 3 components all the time, but to really see the relationship of how they're established and how dependent they are on each other, I think is something that really speaks to fluency instruction and assessment. Thank you guys so much for attending our session today, and for sharing the insights and comments and helping us with our calculations. Dorothy, we really appreciate the engagement from today's session, and hope that you were able to take away something beneficial from today's session for your own practice.